Everyone thinks the crash is the disaster. But the truth is, the crash is the cure. What destroys empires isn't the panic, it's the pattern they ignored for decades, every time. From the South Sea Company in 1720, to Wall Street in 1929, to what's unfolding right now. The symptoms change: tulips, railroad stocks, subprime mortgages, crypto, but the structure is the same. An illusion of infinite wealth, financed by debt that must grow faster than the real economy ever can. They'll tell you it was irrational exuberance, greed, bad regulation. But zoom out. Why were the South Sea shares even allowed to inflate in the first place? Why did the Federal Reserve in the 1920s pump credit into a market already on fire? Why are central banks now bailing out trillion-dollar asset managers while most people can't afford a house? Because empires don't grow without leverage, and leverage doesn't unwind politely. You are living in the final phase of a pattern that began long before you were born, before the US dollar, before Wall Street, before too big to fail. The architecture of every imperial boom was built on one silent assumption: that credit could replace real value, that you could stretch the promise of future income far enough to pay for today's ambitions. But you can't lie to arithmetic. Not forever. In 1720, Britain's national debt was strangling the crown, so it pawned off its obligations to the South Sea Company, a private monopoly with no real assets. In return, shares skyrocketed, not because of trade, because of belief. In 1929, it was margin accounts, people borrowing 90% of the money to buy stocks. The economy didn't grow 10x, but the prices did, for a while. And in 2025, well, look around. Record debt, record valuations. And still they say, it's different this time. But what if it isn't? What if the crash isn't a surprise, but a scheduled demolition? Not a bug in the system, but the release valve. And what if the real question isn't, why did it collapse, but who needed it to? Because every time the crash comes, assets change hands, the public pays, the insiders regroup, and the empire survives, for now. To understand the crash, you have to understand the machine. And to understand the machine, you have to see how it was built, not out of money, but out of promises. Britain in the early 1700s was not yet an empire. It was a kingdom on credit. The crown had just fought the War of Spanish Succession. It cost millions of pounds, and there was no central bank yet as we know it. Only debt. Heavy, royal debt, sold in chunks to private lenders, backed by the taxes of a population that didn't vote. But something changed in 1694. A new institution was born, the Bank of England. Not a vault, not a treasury, but a mechanism. It lent money to the state in exchange for interest and monopoly privileges. It didn't have gold for all its notes, but it didn't need to, because people trusted the system more than the metal. And just like that, credit became national policy. The goal wasn't to balance the books, it was to outgrow them. So how do you turn a broke kingdom into a rich empire? You outsource the risk. You find a vessel, like the South Sea Company, and grant it exclusive rights to trade, to conquer, to collect. You inflate its stock price not by production, but by converting public debt into company shares. And then you let the market feed on itself. That's what happened in 1720. The British government swapped over £30 million in national debt into South Sea shares. Investors piled in. Parliament members were bribed with options. The company didn't trade goods, it traded belief. And for a moment, it worked. The debt vanished from the government's books and reappeared as wealth on the balance sheets of the public. But that wealth had no anchor. No exports, no profits, no real returns, just narrative. This is the birth of the modern financial state. where promises are assets and confidence is collateral. Fast forward 100 years and you'll see the same blueprint, only bigger. The British Empire, now global, didn't just conquer with ships, it conquered with bonds. The East India Company, another private entity with public power, had its own army, its own coinage, and near monopoly over trade from Bengal to Canton. It funneled silver out of India, opium into China, and dividends back to London. But again, the structure was paper. The empire wasn't self-sustaining. It needed constant inputs of capital, labor, and credit. The colonies paid interest through extracted resources. The Bank of England financed wars by selling debt to its own creditors. And as long as expansion continued, nobody noticed the leverage. You see the pattern now? It's not just about stocks or trade. It's about empire-scale IOUs, monetized promises, being sold as wealth. And every time, a financial innovation makes it seem new. In the 1700s, it was the national debt for equity swap. In the 1800s, railway bonds and imperial companies. By the 1920s, it was callable margin accounts with 10% down payments and unlimited upside. Today, it's derivatives, tokenized assets, and sovereign debt backstopped by central banks. But under all of it, the same core mechanic. Debt expands faster than value. Credit builds faster than trust. Paper climbs higher than production. And the only thing keeping it all suspended is momentum. Until it stops. Until someone says, wait, how does this system actually make money? And the answer, if you look close enough, is often, it doesn't. It makes debt and calls it growth. That's why every empire needs a crash. Not to punish speculation, but to reset the ratios. To wipe out the false promises, consolidate assets, and let the cycle restart under new ownership. What they called crisis in 1720 was policy dressed as failure. And this machine, this engine of debt-financed expansion, didn't die with the South Sea bubble. It was refined, globalized, automated. It's still running right now. But the ratios are higher. The leverage is systemic. And the promises? This time, they're yours. Your savings, your pension, your currency. Once the machine is built, it doesn't just run, it accelerates. Because when paper profits look like real growth, everyone wants in. After 1720, you'd think investors would have learned. But within a few decades, Britain was back at it, this time with railroads, canals, and colonial bonds. South Sea was just the warm-up. The real engine of illusion was scale. It's easy to mock those early bubbles. Tulips, joint stock companies, sugar plantations backed by speculation. But in real time, it all felt like progress. Just like today's tech stocks, AI startups, or sovereign bonds with negative yields. Every empire has a moment where the numbers become magical, where debt isn't seen as risk, but fuel, where central banks aren't lenders of last resort, but engines of eternal expansion. And when that illusion kicks in, growth becomes manic. Look at the 1920s, the roaring 20s. They say it was jazz, cars, and freedom. But underneath, a credit mania bigger than anything the world had seen. The Federal Reserve, founded in 1913, had a clear mission: stabilize the currency. But by the mid-1920s, it became a dealer of cheap money. Interest rates were kept low to help Britain repeg to gold. American banks flooded with liquidity. Brokers began offering margin loans to retail investors, meaning you could buy $100 of stock with just $10 in cash. The other $90? Borrowed. It was a financial hallucination, millions of Americans living in a dream world of endless paper gains. The Dow tripled in 5 years. Car companies with no profits raised millions. Utility stocks were traded like crypto tokens. And just like in 1720, everyone had a reason to believe. The government said the economy was fundamentally sound. The banks said defaults were low. The newspapers printed ticker tape gains like war victories. And the average person for the first time, could participate in the magic. That's the most dangerous moment. Not when elites lie, but when the middle class believes it. They believed the South Sea Company would bring back riches from South America. They believed railroad bonds would turn every British town into a trade hub. They believed U.S. steel stocks would rise forever. And today, many believe central banks can print value, not just currency. But here's the trap. When money is easy, prices go up. When prices go up, collateral looks better. When collateral looks better, more money gets lent. It loops. We saw it in housing before 2008. A $200,000 home becomes $400,000. Banks lend more against it. That new loan gets packaged and sold. That sale boosts demand. Demand raises price. And the machine spins faster and faster around the same underlying house. The house didn't change, just the belief about it. That's what makes them seductive. And systemic. The banks don't want to stop the party. They're making record profits. Governments don't want to tighten. They're getting reelected on growth. And ordinary people, they don't want to hear warnings. They want in. The system starts rewarding the blind. The cautious look foolish. The skeptics are mocked. In 1720, Isaac Newton, yes, that Newton, invested in the South Sea Company, made a profit, sold, watched it rise more. FOMO kicked in. He reinvested near the top and lost the equivalent of millions. His quote still echoes today. I can calculate the motions of heavenly bodies, but not the madness of men. This is the phase where arithmetic still works, but no one's listening. Because as long as the illusion holds, why spoil it? And that's the paradox. The illusion needs more believers to survive. And the moment belief slows, the math returns. If you've ever seen something rise too fast, felt the pressure to buy in, then hesitated, and were told you just don't get it, you're not alone. You're watching the empire believe its own story, and history shows what happens next. If this part hit you, especially the Newton part, share it with someone chasing the next sure thing. Let's keep pulling back the curtain. There is always a single moment, quiet, almost invisible, when the illusion dies. Not when markets crash, not when banks fail, but when the math stops bending to the story. For the South Sea Company in 1720, that moment came in early June. Shares had climbed from £100 to over £1,000 in months. Everyone was rich on paper. Even Parliament members congratulated themselves. But behind the scenes, the company needed fresh buyers to convert the remaining national debt into stock. One auction failed. A small one, hardly newsworthy, but it was enough. Demand wasn't infinite. The exponential curve had found gravity. Within days, whispers started. What if the shares are overpriced? What if the company can't meet its obligations? The same MPs who had promoted the scheme began privately selling. Insiders cashed out. And the public, as always, was left holding the peak. From June to September, the stock collapsed back to £150, not because of war or scandal or mismanagement, but because the mechanism required infinite credit, and reality isn't infinite. Collision point, mathematics versus politics. Now jump to 1929. The trigger wasn't Black Tuesday, it was October 24th, the forgotten date. A few major brokers quietly raised margin requirements. They needed more cash from investors who were 90% leveraged. Most people didn't have it. Forced selling began, small at first, like a crack in ice. But the market was built on borrowed money. When one investor sold, prices dipped. When prices dipped, the collateral for everyone else shrank. When collateral shrank, banks demanded more margin. And when people couldn't pay, the spiral fed itself. No conspiracy, no master villain, just the same mechanical truth that killed the South Sea bubble. Debt grows geometrically, cash grows arithmetically, and when the two meet, they don't negotiate. Banks tried to stop the fall. A consortium led by Richard Whitney famously stepped onto the floor of the New York Stock Exchange and placed massive bids for blue-chip stocks. It paused the collapse for hours, not days, hours. You can't rescue a structure built on leverage by throwing money at the fire, because every dollar of liquidation exposes $10 of borrowed belief. By the end of 1929, the Dow had lost nearly 50%. By 1932, it had lost 89%. The asset values of the American middle class didn't just fall, they evaporated, because they never truly existed. They were the future pulled into the present, and then the future refused to pay. Now look at the pattern beneath the crashes. In 1720, shareholders discovered the South Sea Company never had the cash flow to justify its price. In 1929, investors learned the U.S. economy couldn't support infinite margin debt and falling interest rates simultaneously. The math exposed the political illusion. And today, in 2025, you can already see the fracture lines. Sovereign debt at historic highs. Central banks fighting inflation while simultaneously backstopping markets. Trillions in asset prices dependent on near-zero interest rates. Pensions expecting returns that the real economy cannot deliver. A generation conditioned to believe that stocks only go up because central banks won't let them fall. It's the same structure, the same leverage, the same belief that a political institution, a parliament, a central bank, a treasury, can outvote arithmetic. But crashes don't ask for permission. When trust slows, when liquidity tightens, when collateral loses value, the spiral begins exactly as it did in 1720 and 1929, quietly, mechanically, inevitably. The empire always thinks it can control the correction. Politicians issue reassuring statements. Bankers swear liquidity is adequate. Regulators hold emergency meetings. And the public waits. But underneath, the numbers are already moving. Because once the illusion phase ends, revelation spreads faster than belief. Every participant suddenly turns into a seller. No one wants to be the last one holding the promises. This is the moment when arithmetic takes back power, when the empire's narrative dissolves, when the system shows what it truly was, a leveraged bet on confidence. And confidence has no lender of last resort. If you've ever felt that strange moment, when everything still looks calm but something feels off, that's the fracture. That's the point where history begins to rhyme. If this exposed the hidden mechanics behind every major crash, tell me in the comments, which era feels most similar to 2025, 1720 or 1929? When a crash happens, the world stares at the wreckage, bankruptcies, foreclosures, suicides, riots. But what's far more important is what gets rebuilt after. Because in every empire, after every collapse, someone stays standing. And they don't rebuild the old system, they rebuild control. Let's go back. After the South Sea bubble burst in 1720, the British financial elite didn't fall. The public did. Thousands of households lost everything. Parliament held inquiries. Executives were disgraced. Some were jailed. But the Bank of England? It quietly absorbed South Sea liabilities. Government debt was consolidated. By 1723, the Crown had even more power over money issuance, and the public had even less access to real assets. The illusion was over, but the mechanism survived. Fast forward to 1930s America. The Federal Reserve had failed catastrophically. It allowed the bubble to inflate, then stood by during the collapse. Banks failed in waves. 9,000 institutions wiped out. Depositors wiped out with them. So what did the U.S. do? In 1933, Franklin Roosevelt closed the banks for 4 days. Then, by executive order, he banned the private ownership of gold. Americans were forced to turn in their gold at $20.67 an ounce under threat of jail. Months later, the government revalued gold to $35 an ounce, inflating the dollar supply and devaluing everyone's savings. The wealth didn't vanish. It transferred, just like in 1720. Now the government had full monetary control. And the Fed? It wasn't punished. It was expanded. It was given new tools, more authority, and a blank check to stabilize the future. Every time, the same outcome. The people lose assets. The system gains power. Which brings us to now, 2025. You live in a world that never recovered from 2008. It just changed the wallpaper. Back then, the entire global financial system nearly collapsed. But instead of breaking up the megabanks, they were bailed out. Instead of reforming the derivatives casino, it was expanded. Instead of defaulting, governments transferred trillions of debt to central banks by printing. The result? An illusion of recovery. But under the surface, central banks now own unprecedented levels of government bonds. Interest rates have been artificially suppressed for over a decade. The average citizen? Priced out of housing, working multiple jobs, or dependent on asset bubbles to retire. It's not a conspiracy. It's a machine, one that evolved to protect itself, not you. When COVID hit, the same pattern repeated. In 2020, the U.S. printed over $3 trillion in a few months. Stock markets crashed briefly, then soared. Not because businesses were booming, but because liquidity drowned the fire. Meanwhile, real wages stagnated, inflation surged, and just like the South Sea shareholders or the 1920s margin buyers, people were told, "Don't worry, this is fine." Now, the U.S. debt has passed $40 trillion. Japan's central bank owns half its own bond market. Europe is trapped between energy shocks and monetary dependence. But here's what matters. The structure has not changed. Debt is still the fuel. Assets are still inflated. The promises are still bigger than the real economy can ever deliver. And just like 1720 and 1929, someone will be left holding the bag. It won't be the bankers. It won't be the institutions. It will be you, your pension fund, your savings account, your purchasing power. Because the next crash isn't about stocks or houses. It's about trust. And once that breaks, currency itself becomes the question. That's what they faced in the 1790s in France with the assignats. That's what Weimar Germany faced in the 1920s. That's what Argentina, Zimbabwe, and Lebanon live with now. And if the arithmetic fails in the U.S., the issuer of the global reserve currency, the consequences won't stop at any border. Here's the hidden continuity across 3 centuries. Every crash revealed that value had been hollowed out. Every recovery replaced it with a new layer of control. And every time, fewer people owned more. Because the crash is not the end of the cycle, it's the handoff, a transfer of real assets from the public to the consolidators, from holders of fake wealth to holders of real power. Now look around you. The system tells you to invest in index funds, to hold your wealth in fiat currency, to trust the process. But beneath that, food prices rising, rents surging, savings losing value against inflation, gold and Bitcoin quietly hoarded by institutions. The music is still playing, but the chairs are being removed. If you're watching this and feeling that deep unease, like the crash has already started just in slow motion, you're not imagining it. Arithmetic is already cracking the surface, and the story is already shifting. If this brought the modern system into focus for you, leave a comment, "I see the pattern now." Let's finish what we started. Empires don't fall because of greed. They fall when the numbers outgrow the stories. You can lie to the public. You can lie to investors. You can even lie to yourself. But arithmetic does not care. It doesn't vote. It doesn't negotiate. It doesn't bail out. In 1720, they told themselves debt could be turned into wealth through clever accounting and optimism. In 1929, they believed markets could self-correct until they couldn't. And now, in 2025, we are told that central banks can bend the laws of economics forever. But the pattern never changed. Promise more than you can produce, fund growth with debt, deny the consequences. Blame the fallout on market psychology, and then start over with even fewer people in control. What if the real problem isn't any one crash, but the system that needs crashes to function? Every time the illusion collapses, it isn't just investors who suffer. It's workers, savers, families, people who didn't gamble but still lost. Because they were born into a machine where their currency, their pensions, their time are all priced by leveraged promises. It's not moral failure. It's structural design. So here's your warning. If you hear phrases like soft landing, transitory pain, or temporary liquidity adjustment, know that the real adjustment has already begun. History shows it clearly. Those who held paper lost. Those who held real assets endured. And those who understood why it was happening had a chance to rebuild. This isn't fear, it's clarity. Because when you see the cycle for what it is, you stop asking when the crash will end and start asking who will control the system that rises from the rubble. And here's the last truth. Empires don't die when they collapse. They die when no one believes them anymore. If this whole journey rewired how you see money, power, and history, share this with someone still living in the illusion. And tell us in the comments, will you be ready when the arithmetic returns?